For those of you who don't know us, SYPartners, just a little bit about who we are. We're a transformation consultancy, and we tend to work with organizations during critical turning points. So times when there's a brand new leadership team or a new acquisition or there's rapid growth, those big moments that require big, bold thinking, that require, getting rid of the status quo and thinking about something new. Those moments that require really thinking about the human, but also thinking about the big system changes that are required to transform an organization. And that kind of thinking got us so excited to meet Iris and Siri, who I will introduce in just a minute. But it's this notion, this data-driven solutions to really embedding fairness into organizations. That idea is so connected to our belief system that the way to really build vital futures is through unleashing collective potential that often sits so dormant outside and inside organizations. And that is what compels SYP to be so excited to have Iris and Siri here tonight, and hopefully for you guys as well. So without further ado, just a quick intro to our awesome authors here, starting with Iris Bohnet is the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government and the co-director of the Women and Public Policy Program at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is a behavioral economist and the author of the award-winning book, What Works, which is the book that precedes this new book, Make Work Fair. Welcome, Iris. And Siri Chilazi is a senior researcher at the Women and Public Policy Program at the Harvard Kennedy School, whose life work is to advance gender equality in the workplace. She both conducts research and shares insights with organizations through speaking and consulting. Welcome, Siri.
I want you to think of an analogy for 1 second. Imagine that you have two sprinters who are about to embark on the 100-meter dash, and they are equally as fast. If they start on the starting line and 100 meters later, they reach the finish line, who's going to finish first? It's not a trick question, friends. Well, if they're equally as fast, they're going to finish at the same time, aren't they? Sadly, though, that's not representative of the situation that we find ourselves in the real world and in the workplace today. A much more accurate analogy is that one of those sprinters is actually starting about 20 meters behind the other one. And of course, a lot of the approaches that we've taken to this seeming unfairness is to look at the sprinter whose start line is 20 meters behind and say, let's give you a faster pair of shoes, more technologically advanced pair of shoes, or give you a different outfit, or let's tweak your running technique so that you move your arms in a slightly different way. And while all of those fixes might make that second sprinter marginally faster, they're never going to make up for the fact that their starting line is 20 meters behind. So when we're talking about making work fair, what we are talking about is not trying to fix the sprinters or fix individuals in our workplaces, but instead fix the systems so that everyone starts on the same starting line and gets a level playing field on which to play, an equal chance to succeed to their fullest potential. And of course, in the real world, we have more than two sprinters, and they're not all going to be equally as fast because people have different talents, skills, capabilities, preferences. Not everybody wants to work 80 hours a week or become the CEO. But in order for organizations to reach their own highest performance, they need to have the right people in the right roles doing their best work at the right time. And we only get there if we have a genuinely level playing field.
So would you say fairness is really a code word for DE&I?
No. I think for us, it goes much deeper than that. We, of course, started writing the book 2.5 years ago, much before the current moment and the backlash that we're seeing now against DEI. One of the reasons we landed on the concept of fairness is that it's something we've seen resonate really broadly in our work with organizations and leaders. In fact, there's a lot of research to suggest that fairness is a really fundamental human value. Kids as young as 4 and 5 years old start to really recognize fairness and unfairness and react very strongly to displays of unfairness. So that's one of the reasons is we feel like this is the common denominator from which we can start to build and have these important conversations. But it's also because fairness is actually something deeper than just, oh, here's the representational metrics, or, oh, people are feeling included. Sometimes people feel included, but the playing field is very unlevel. You might not even know that you're being paid unfairly, right? You might feel great about your workplace, but there might still be a really unlevel playing field underneath, and you might not even be aware of it. So for us, fairness encapsulates that deeper, more profound ideal.
Maybe I can add something to that. So when we wrote the book, we in fact took a very close look at the approaches that have been used so far. And we wanted to offer it's not a new word, but a new way of describing what we think we should be doing with many of the goals that DI has being shared. So this is not about goals, not about the final outcome, but we would argue that we might have to use some different approaches to get to those goals faster and better. And so, for example, those of you who know us won't be surprised to hear me say that, sadly, diversity training, which has been the favorite tool of American corporations, not just in the US, it also spread to Europe, but mostly came from the US. We have no evidence suggesting that that's really working. It's incredibly hard to change behaviors. It's incredibly hard to change mindsets. And so, so we want to be really evidence-based and not very ideological, but just, speak truth to power in some ways with the term fairness.
Great. That's helpful. And you mentioned a little bit about this DE&I backlash, and that is the environment that we're operating in right now. And I know the conversation has really shifted towards this idea of meritocracy, right? And some people are now saying that DI itself causes discrimination. What do you make of this moment, and what do we do about it?
So I think we have a very strong feeling about that, in that there is no meritocracy without fairness. I'm going to repeat that. It's impossible to have meritocracy without fairness. At this point, we have about 300 studies that we discuss in the book that looked at just one issue, and that is how we hire. And what these studies typically tend to do is they send the same resume to an organization. Probably some of your organizations have been part of this experiment unknowingly, because literally thousands and thousands of these resumes have been sent to the large companies in this country. So you get the same resume, and for example, just the name is different. Could be the gender, could be signaling something about your race, your ethnicity, your background, could be an extracurricular activity that is different, that might signal something about your religious background, about your sexual orientation. And in all of these studies, what we find is that, sadly, people with the exact same qualifications, exact same competencies are not equally as likely to get a call back. Right? That's going back to Siri's earlier example of the 100-meter dash. We're just not living in a world where fairness is given. So I don't think we can even talk about meritocracy when we still have this problem that, for example, somebody with a female-sounding name is less likely to be invited to an interview for an engineering job, and somebody with a male-sounding name is less likely to be invited to an interview for a teacher or for a nursing position. So it goes both ways, because these stereotypes are strong. We tend to associate certain jobs with men and certain jobs with women. So yes, meritocracy is an interesting goal for us to have, but let's fix the world first.
So it sounds like you agree with it as a concept, but just practically, it's not something that we're living right now.
Exactly. We think it's an incredibly worthwhile ideal to strive for, but it's important to understand that the world has not yet seen a meritocracy in action. So this is not a state of the world that we can go back to. It is something that we have to create, in fact, for the very first time. The good news is that we have all this research that can help guide us there, because we know what those barriers look like. We know what the factors are that are hindering certain people in hiring, in promotions, in the way we conduct our meetings, in the way we evaluate people's performance. And we can fix the underlying systems to, in fact, make those processes more meritocratic than they are today.
What would you say to companies that are saying, oh, fairness is actually lowering our standards? How would you shift the mindset so that leaders see fairness as a way to actually unlock true merit?
we would say, and we are saying, let the data speak. Let the data speak, right? This is not, again, we have to get beyond ideology. I don't think we would exclude the possibility of reverse discrimination, but we just haven't seen it in the data. We really haven't seen it in the data. And so at this point, there's just a lot of talk without a lot of evidence.
One piece of evidence I'd love to share is the study from the European Central Bank, which set goals to increase the proportion of women in its management ranks in 2013. It reached the goal, which was 30% women among managers in 2019. And the lovely thing that the ECB did was that it partnered with researchers before, during, and after these goals to actually track what happened, to collect the data. And what they found was that the women who had been promoted into management while the goals were in place ended up having higher salary trajectories than their peer men. So let that sink in for a second. What that means is the ECB had been promoting men that weren't performing as well as the women that it then ended up promoting with the help of the goals. So goals are, of course, just one intervention among many that we can use. It's a particularly effective one. But the point here is that the organization ended up performing collectively better when it debiased its promotion processes. So instead of lowering the standards, it actually raised the standards in the best of ways.
You also mentioned about the trainings, like trainings don't work. I think a lot of us in this room would say we aren't happy with the progress that's been made over the last 4 years in terms of building more fair organizations. And yet there's been so much energy and effort, especially in previous contexts where there was so much attention to it. So why is it so hard to move the needle on this?
So my background is in behavioral economics, as you mentioned, and I just want to take a big picture view for a moment. It actually is incredibly hard to change attitudes. So beyond diversity, beyond equity, beyond racial bias, gender bias, other biases, just generally, we're just, pretty stubborn minds that we all have. And so I think it's just hard to move people. I think we just have to acknowledge that. And then secondly, we do have evolved, actually, I should say, on trainings in the sense that we kind of have been very pessimistic, given we have about 500 studies that haven't found a correlation between whether or not a company has a training, for example, and how diverse the workforce is, as one of the examples. So we've kind of, most of our work is more of a systemic nature, but then a few months ago, we had a bit of a wake-up call thinking, well, people and organizations keep doing these trainings for many reasons, partly to check the box, partly because it's relatively cheap to do, partly because it's good signaling so your employees see that you're doing something. And none of those are good reasons. But we're just telling you, so they keep happening despite the fact that we've been talking, and we're not the only ones, but we've been talking about how ineffective they are. And so we got together with a number of colleagues and we tried to redesign training. And we actually just published a paper in Science on a behaviorally designed diversity training. That's literally the title of the paper. And we try to do a few things. So first of all, most trainings that you probably all have participated in happened at a random moment in time. Maybe during onboarding or once a year, you get an email, and then you have a reminder a week later, a month later, take the training. So the timeliness is very important. For anything, for any training, right? So have to think about what is the person going to be doing tomorrow or in a month from now, or when is this going to be useful? So that was important for us. The second one was most of these trainings don't focus on your types of jobs or your responsibilities, the types of tasks that you have to do tomorrow again, or in a week from now. So it needed to be focused. That was a second insight. And a third one, we wanted to have an authority figure deliver the training to make clear to the employees this was a large, over 100,000 people company, engineering and telecommunications. So we needed, you wanted to have that authority figure kind of as a signal that we're really serious about the training. And so we ran it. So we ran a randomized control trial. I'm just going to quickly tell you because that's how we normally do our research. We want to have a control group and a treatment group. We give the treatment group the medicine. We give the control group the placebo, literally. And then we measure, do the people who get the medicine, do they behave differently from the people who get the placebo? And that's exactly what we did here as well. So some hiring managers, that was our target group. Some managers got the training and others got another type of intervention but not a specific training. And that training was very specific about the hiring task. And so that's where that specificity comes in because these hiring managers had to move people from the long list to the short list. And they literally had to do that like tomorrow or 2 days from now. So it was very, very timely, very, very targeted, talked about the values that this company is upholding, values of diversity and inclusion, but also talked about complementarity of skills and how important it is to think outside of the box as you create your team. So don't replicate yourself, and gave them some tools also in thinking about how valuable it is to focus on skills rather than social identities, etc. So it sounds like big, but it was literally a 7-minute video and delivered again by some senior managers. And then we just looked, do these hiring managers now behave differently? And what we found was that people who got the treatment, right, the medicine, were more likely to invite women to be interviewed. They were more likely to invite and hire people from outside of the kind of home country. So this company, as I said, is very big in 100 different countries. And so one of their concerns was that I'm Swiss originally, the Swiss hired the Swiss, the Mexicans hire Mexicans, and that the company wasn't actually really benefiting from that large talent pool that they had already, given that they were active in all these different places. So the biggest winner actually were women from outside of that home country. And so we wrote this up because we felt that given that trainings are so popular, maybe we could make them a little better. Right? Maybe we could change them so that would actually have impact on behaviors.
But there's another point too that this example makes, and it goes back to your question about why has this been so hard? And why haven't all our efforts, all the money, the time, the goodwill, the energy and attention that has been spent, and it has been really quite sizable over the last few years, why haven't we seen more results from all of that? And part of the reason is because these efforts have often been siloed off to the side instead of being embedded into the mainstream of what we're already doing. So training is an excellent example. You maybe take an hour-long module at onboarding or at a predetermined time once a year. In our redesigned behavioral training, it was embedded into the workflow of hiring that was already going to happen no matter what. And these types of embedded solutions not only have been proven to be more effective, but they're also more resistant to political winds changing, economic upturns and downturns, right? When budgets get cut, it's very easy to strike off a line item. Oh, the networking reception, the ERG budget, the budget for the diversity training. But you're not going to overhaul your hiring. You're not going to overhaul how you evaluate performance or promote, because that's happening no matter who sits in the White House or no matter what the macroeconomic conditions are. So embedding has the enormous advantage of not only being more effective, but almost being proofed to some of these external challenges that we're seeing right now.
You talk a lot about that beliefs are really hard to change. You mentioned this, and you write it in your book as well. You say, you like behavioral science because it allows us to change outcomes without trying to tackle people's deeply held beliefs. People's actions change when the systems surrounding them change, even if their unconscious or conscious biases do not. That made me think about, though, like someone has to make the decision to do the rewiring, right? That there is still a role that beliefs play in all this, even if the premise of the behavioral science is that you don't have to get at the beliefs.
It's a great point. Someone somewhere does, but it can be simpler and smaller scale than people think. So I'd love to share with you the example and the story of Roz Atkins. Does anybody know Roz Atkins, by the way? He's a journalist at the BBC. He's recently spent a lot of time in the US. He actually covered our elections for the BBC globally. He's a career journalist. He, for a very long time, was the anchor of a prime time, 1 hour long news magazine show. And he cares greatly about the quality of his journalism. And he has this view that's shared by many of his fellow journalists that in order to be the highest quality, his journalism has to be reflective of the world that it reports on. He realized a few years ago, however, that he had no data to know whether that was happening, whether he was delivering on that commitment. So the first thing we love about Roz is instead of sitting there and waiting for HR or people analytics or a magical elf to come deliver the data to him, he said, let me just generate it myself. He and his team started spending about 2 minutes after each night's show, counting, initially on Post-its, how many women and how many men did we invite on our show as contributors and, feature them on screen during this hour. After a month, they discovered that they were on average at 39% women, much lower than they expected. They set themselves a goal of getting to parity, 50-50, because broadly speaking, approximately speaking, that's what the world is. And then they got themselves there in 4 months. Great. That would have been a success story already. But then, and this is where we get to someone has to think about this part, he started sharing the approach. Now, Roz didn't have any organizational authority to make anyone else do anything. He didn't have a budget available. He couldn't incentivize people. All he could do was appeal to his colleagues' shared motivation as journalists of generating the highest quality journalism and say, my team and I discovered a tool that can help us get there. And I know you care about the same things as I do. This tool might be helpful for you as well. And we're happy to share what we learned, our methodology. They moved from Post-its to Google spreadsheets, and then they moved to a very fancy dashboard later. We'll help you along the way. And he very strategically targeted other journalists and programs in the beginning that he thought would be positively disposed and that he knew to be influential within the BBC. Once he got a couple of those initial programs on board and he started talking more broadly, he started getting a lot of pushback. I was there interviewing people about the project for a case study, and some of the things that I heard was that this is social engineering gone mad, that this is a program to make men extinct. 50-50 was the goal. Apparently that equals extinction for some. So he was getting some real pushback. There were absolutely people who didn't agree with him. He let that go. He said, no problem. If you don't want to do it, fine. But what happened was as more programs started signing up, very quickly it became the social norm. Journalists were looking around and saying, wait a second, this is what everyone else is doing. We're the only team in this whole division that's not participating. And so without changing people's minds, a lot of those programs and in the end got on board anyway because it had become the social norm, because it had become the thing to do. And that's one of the powerful mechanisms for changing behavior. So yes, someone somewhere at some point has to believe in order for any change to happen, but not nearly everyone. Because once we get gears of change turning, mechanisms of social influence and norms can take over.
It's really interesting. I'm going to ask one more question. I have more, but I'm going to ask one more and then open it up. So if you guys have questions, start thinking, get ready. The mic's going to come to you. I want to talk about the business case. So you all talk in the book about it. You don't feel like it makes sense that we have to make the business case for fairness because it sends a signal to underrepresented groups that they are only valuable if they improve the bottom line. You also say, why do those not in power have to make the case for why they deserve to be there when the opposite is not true? Which is a really interesting provocation. But then on the flip side, you are making the business case, right? Like there is a case to be made that fairness is getting to these outcomes that we desire. So why not? Why not make the case?
So as we wrote this, we sometimes talked about child labor, right? I don't think we use the business case to do away with child labor. These are small hands. They can do carpets really well. And still many of us don't want to buy a rug that was produced by a 4-year-old child. That is not the business case. That's the human rights case. And so we actually feel quite strongly that fairness is about human rights, and we don't have to prove that children are actually worse than adults. We don't want children to work because we believe that that's fundamentally the wrong thing to do. And so in that sense, it's important to us to always start with the human rights case. Having said this, of course, we're also realistic, and we've worked with many, many companies, many organizations. So yes, of course, 100% talent pool is better than 50% of the talent pool. So yes, there is a case to be made that we should be unbiased and we should clean up our processes so that we can benefit from the best talent that is out there. So we're not denying that there are reasons to de-bias the processes that we have, but we don't think at the end of the day that can be the motivations for the reasons that you just mentioned. So I'll give you maybe a quick example from a study that we did in Australia, which might resonate with some of you. So we were approached by one of the largest employers in Australia with a puzzle. So they had noted that they have all these applicants who are applying to positions of leadership, and then they choose somebody, and then they send the rejected applicants an email saying, thank you for applying, sorry you didn't get the job. There are similar types of opportunities available in our organization, please reapply. And they found that men were twice as likely to reapply. And that's when we got the call. And so then, you use a little bit of your behavioral science and your what you know about potential gender differences in behaviors. And so we ran an experiment with them where we only added one sentence to that email. Namely, we asked them, well, who do you write to? And they said, well, the top 20% of the applicants. And we said, add that sentence. Take that ambiguity away so people know that they have a real chance, that you're not just, this is not a cheap talk, but in fact, they are at the top and you really want them to reapply. That closed the gender gap. Now, this clearly also was a business motivation and maybe a combination of this is just wrong, but also we've just gone through all of these applications. We've just, rank ordered people, and we would love for them to be in the pool because we like them. Number 2, number 3, number 4, there are other jobs for them. So that probably was one of the motivations, but you should have seen them. They were just intrinsically happy that a gap that was kind of unexplainable, wasn't helpful to them, and deprived some people of some interesting opportunities, just disappeared. So often I think the two can go hand in hand.
Your example is just one of so many in the book that is just one small thing like that can make such a sizable difference. It's really impressive. Okay, who has a question? Anyone?
You're basically asking how concerned am I about this moment in time? That I don't know. I have a very good answer here. I think your testimony, you all who are here and the people who are coming to our talks, that there are still lots of people in this country who believe that diversity is a value that we should aspire to. And I think we have to keep being role models, and we have to keep creating those role models.
And it's not only role models at the highest levels, CEOs, presidents, senators, things like this. In fact, sometimes the most powerful role models are people who are slightly aspirational, but relatively close to where you are, so that you can actually see yourself potentially becoming that. A great example of this was a study that was done with a project or a program where female scientists went to visit high school-aged girls in schools in Paris. They would go to the classroom for a 1 hour long presentation. They were maybe 10 years older than the girls in these classrooms, and just talk about the life of a scientist, their work, how they got to where they are. And long story short, the high school aged women that had been exposed to these real world role models for 1 hour were significantly more likely to pursue career educational paths in STEM going forward. So, and these were normal people. So I think the hopeful side of the story, and the part that gives me hope, is we have managed to bring in a lot more talent and more diverse talent into the workplace in general, and also to some extent leadership up until now. That's making a difference every day in what we're seeing. And I'm hopeful that that will persist.
So, you're asking me a question that I can't completely, so we cannot rule out. We can never rule out anything as scientists, right? So we haven't studied everything, so I don't know. So all I can say, at this point, we have no data suggesting that reverse discrimination has happened. We just don't have it. We don't see it in the data. That doesn't mean, we all know stories. We probably all have friends who feel like that might have happened. So that's why I can't say it never happens. It has never happened. But the data that we have kind of go in the direction that you would expect, that we do have to debias our hiring processes, our performance appraisal processes. Just to give you an example of performance appraisals, we worked with a large financial services company headquartered in this country, actually, on their performance appraisals, and they gave us all their data. And why I was interested in working with the company was because they actually had a glitch in the system at some point and couldn't do something that I was very interested in. And I'm telling, why is this interesting for me as a researcher? Because it's almost like an experiment. It's almost like like an A/B test. It's not quite an A/B test, but it's still something that happened that wasn't under the control of the company. And then we can see what difference did it make. So what happened was that this is a company, like probably many of yours, that shares self-evaluations with managers before managers make up their minds. And I have been concerned about this for quite some time, that if there are, let's say, cross-cultural differences in people's willingness or ability to shine the light on themselves, and we know there are gender differences in people's willingness or ability to shine the light on themselves because people might fear backlash or repercussions, or racial differences in that could lead to a vicious circle where my lower self-evaluation influences my manager has a curve to fit, and given that I started out lower, he's like, oh, thank God, here's your 5 out of 10 or something like that. So what we found in that data is that indeed women did give themselves lower self-evaluations than men, and in particular women of color. And we saw that carried over to the managers, although the managers actually in this firm, which was quite interesting, corrected for some of the gap already. But given that women of color started out so much lower, that gap didn't close. And so what we could show, particularly for newly hired people who didn't have a history in the firm, when managers didn't have their self-evaluations available, there was no gap between women of color, between white women, between white men and white men. So I'm just as an example, right? So I let the data speak. If we had found that white men are at the bottom of the distribution and give themselves lower self-evaluations and influence their managers, and we need to go rescue white men, I would have done that. That's right. That's the power of data. But the power of the data also tells us that we can never exclude an alternative, because of course I haven't studied every financial services company in the world, and I can't tell you whether that's generalizable or not. In that sense, I do think I can affirmatively say we don't know of evidence suggesting reverse discrimination.
But we would always encourage companies to let the data speak, to collect it, and to do what the European Central Bank did, which is look at who you're promoting under different kinds of programs. It doesn't have to be goals. It could be in the presence of training, or maybe you introduce a new employee resource group, right? What happens to the members of the employee resource group? Are they more likely to get promoted? Are they more likely to have mentors and sponsors? Do their performance evaluation scores increase compared to their peers who are not members of these groups? This is all stuff that we can measure, and the data will tell the tale. I'm not sure if we know what the magic number is. There's been some studies to suggest that maybe 30% is a critical mass. And then there's one fascinating study that I'd love to share, which shows that it's actually a lot lower, around 10%. This study looked at middle schoolers in New Jersey. The state of New Jersey, just across the river there. Their goal was to decrease harassment and bullying in schools. So they partnered with researchers led by Betsy Levy-Pollock from Princeton, and they randomly selected schools, and within those schools, randomly selected a subset of students to attend an anti-bullying intervention. So the kids were trained to kind of recognize bullying behaviors, stand up in the face of them, and try to contribute to a better overall culture. And then they let the kids go back to business as usual, as we would say, right? Their regular lives. And what they found was that this was very successful in reducing harassment and bullying behaviors overall, especially when the kids who had been randomly selected to be part of this intervention were the cool kids, the influential ones, the few in large groups that everyone else looks to for cues on how do we do things around here? Is this okay? Is that okay? Everybody's nodding because we've all seen it, right? We live this reality. There's the technical term is social reference, but there's always, even in large groups, some people whose role modeling and whose behaviors are a little bit more influential than others. So a handful of people in groups as large as hundreds can actually shift the social norms. That's good news. It can also be bad news because norms are very malleable in both directions, and they can be used as a tool for good, and they can also be used as a tool for evil, as we've also seen in the world.
And you call them in your book these norm entrepreneurs, right? And so how do you find them? How do you, yes, in middle school, it's maybe easy to know who the cool kids are, but in an organization, like, how do you spot these?
I'm not sure if it's that different, Sabrina. I think
I guess I'm not in the club then. No, but how do you find these norm entrepreneurs, and like, how much do you like deliberately, put them to work?
So I can start and then you can continue. Everyone should be one. All of us in this room should be norm entrepreneurs. It's very straightforward, right? It's through your own role modeling and through the things that you do every day, working to create and uphold the types of norms that you wish to see, which may be aligned with what's already happening, or it may entail changing the direction. Let me give you a very simple example from meetings. Many of us have worked at one time or another in an organization where the culture in meetings was one of rampant interruptions and not necessarily turn taking, a couple of loud voices dominating the conversation. So one thing you could do as a norm entrepreneur, if you think that's not optimal, and if you'd rather have a more respectful culture in meetings, is to interrupt the interrupter. And next time someone makes an interruption, and you go, oh, excuse me, I'd love to hear Iris for a point, please. Sabrina, we'll come back to you in just a second. And that might feel a little risky the first time, but then you do it again next week. And then someone else feels emboldened based on your example to do it once or twice. And soon enough, we find ourselves in a new norm where the interruptions are no longer acceptable. And I think the interrupters, to your earlier point about the difference between changing behaviors and underlying attitudes, the interrupters probably love interrupting others as much as they ever did. That attitude has not changed, but their calculation of how the collective is going to respond to it and the consequences for them is now different. They're going to get called out. We humans don't like getting called out. We don't want to be outside of the herd. And as a result, interruptions will decrease.
No, I mean, I completely agree. I think it's a wonderful example. So, but you could do this more strategically if you wanted to. So what, of course, researchers often do are these network analyses, trying to understand, so who is in the node, right? Who is kind of in the middle and has all of these different connections. And then you try to influence that person. And that actually was what Betsy Pollack did in some of her work as well, kind of trying to find who are the potential norm entrepreneurs based on that, the powerful norm entrepreneurs based on an analysis. When I teach negotiation, or used to teach negotiation, haven't actually for quite some time, we often talk about focusing on people others defer to, right? So you're kind of strategically thinking, well, who do I need to have on my side as I'm trying to build my coalition? Is it the most senior person? Is it the loudest voice? Is it the most critical person? Because others might change their mind. Because now the person who was most critical has changed their mind. So there's a lot of thinking can go into the strategy of creating norm entrepreneurship. But having said this, I mean, I completely agree with Siri that we all can shift norms around us in large and small ways by deciding who is even in front of the room, who presents the paper, who greets the person at the entrance, who meets the client. I mean, there's just so many places where you can change what people think is normal in this organization.
Thank you. Makes me think of something I just read also about a recent development, which is apparently there's been an initiative in the US military across the different branches, some kind of working group to promote the interests of women. And they've examined over the last several decades various issues that have affected women, especially in the military, and that made recommendations and got some things changed. And one of the things that they were working on recently was getting different uniforms for female fighter pilots. The fighter pilot uniform, the traditional one, is it's like an overall, right? And for men, that works. For women, when they need to use the bathroom, they need to take the whole thing off. It's unfeasible, it's uncomfortable, it's complicated, it takes too much time, it just doesn't work. So they have redesigned a new uniform that is, for all intents and purposes, identical. It's just two pieces, a top and a bottom. And some people could argue, right, that this is unfair because we had these uniforms and now we're bringing women into the military and into our fighter jet cockpits, and now we have to make special accommodations for them. I would really like to reframe that argument and say, back to the 100-meter dash, men fighter jet pilots from this whole time have had the joy and benefit of uniforms that fit them, that allow them to focus on the very important task at hand and not worry about being physically uncomfortable. In order to level the playing field, we must ensure that all fighter jet pilots, regardless of gender or body size or anything else, have that basic requirement met so that they can focus on the job at hand and do their best work for our country. And so I think it's that free frame of saying fairness requires us to provide everybody with a well-fitting uniform as a basic condition of doing the work. And I think there's easy parallels that we can draw to other workplaces where we think about, again, for example, having voice in meetings, having your ideas heard as a basic condition for allowing everyone to contribute their best talents for the organization. So I'm excited that we're having this conversation today and at this time, really, because I think we need to take it head on and go full in for the reframe and say, no, we're not going to concede ground on this because fairness requires everybody to get the same resources to succeed.
Completely agreed. But Siri, as you were speaking, I thought about a meeting that we recently had with a company. And because many of you work in corporate America, I thought I'm going to share what I saw happen in that company, which I imagine is also what some of you are going through right now. And that is they did a bit of a cost-benefit analysis, kind of to get a bit of sense of what is our risk appetite as an organization. What are the riskiest things that we could be doing? What are the least risky things that we could be doing to pursue the goals that we have? So not changing the goals that they have, but making the processes they use to achieve those goals more compliant with what may or may not be legal, which is all, of course, a little bit in the gray zone right now. So I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving legal advice here. It's not the argument I'm trying to make. But we are realistic that corporations in America are all thinking about this and have made different choices. So I don't only want us to focus on the ones that, have been very loud about doing away with DI. There have also been others which have reaffirmed their commitment to DI or equity or fairness, the goal that we're pursuing here. So I do think we have to be realistic, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was a bit of a reshift in that maybe some of the riskiest things we might see less of, but people might focus more on others. And for example, processes are still up for grabs. I mean, independent of our current political environment, Siri and I are very, as you have heard us speak, we're very passionate about fixing our processes because there's a lot to be gained when we fix our hiring processes and don't use unstructured interviews, but use, in fact, a tool that is more predictive of future performance, such as a work sample test, right? So I hope we cannot this is a terrible expression, but I'm going to use it anyway, throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? But really think hard and be just realistic about the current environment and also the risk that the company is willing to take, but then think creatively about this is our goal, what strategies can we still pursue that are kind of more compliant? given that we are in New York, I wanted to celebrate that New York was one of the first places that passed laws that require software providers in the hiring space to test the software before it's unleashed on people. So that's basically been our take on AI, that AI has enormous potential, we all know, and would be a longer discussion to talk about everything that goes into AI, but of course it's trained on the past, and so the biases that we have had in the past will also be relevant for the future. Now, having said this, if we got this right, we wouldn't have to worry about thousands and millions of human screeners, but we could, in fact, have an AI that is less biased than these thousands of human screeners, right? There are real advantages of AI. AI doesn't get tired. So we know that human screeners do not give the same attention to application number 275, but an algorithm won't mind. So there are some advantages, right? That algorithm, there's many more, they're faster, more complexity, all of that. But I think the big message here for us is we need to test much more. So for example, we don't know, or I don't know, at least, Siri is a chemist, has a background in chemistry. I don't know the ingredients of an aspirin, but I'm taking the aspirin because I know it has been tested, that somebody looked at this. I trust the institution. I trust the A/B tests, the clinical trials that were performed. But we don't have something like that for AI at this point. And I very strongly believe we need something like this.
So interesting that you mentioned having an advantage and giving that up. That theme of, is this a zero-sum game? And even if it's not, how do we overcome the very strong feelings and perceptions that it is a zero-sum game? I think that's very top of mind. We feel very strongly that fairness is the ultimate expander of the pie for everybody's benefit. Let me give you just two quick examples. One is this wonderful study that was able to quantify how much more we've all benefited from the reduction of barriers in the workplace since the 1960s. If we go back in our minds, we remember that we don't directly remember, but we know from the history books that the 1960s were a time when Black people couldn't participate equally in the workforce. It was okay to have job advertisement that said men only, and so on and so forth. So we've really expanded our access to the talent pool. As a result, that accounts for 40% of the increase in the US GDP per capita since the 1960s. Ultimate example of how we've all become more prosperous as a result of having more fairness in the workplace. So that's one thing. The other example I want to give, which goes more to the process design aspect of this, is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came into force in 1990. Everybody's nodding. That's the law that required the curbs to be smooth at the end, installing elevators and ramps, in addition to just stairs and so forth. Well, that was, of course, initially designed, and the law was inspired by the differing needs of people who had mobility constraints. And by the way, at the time, that was about 4% of the US population. Fast forward to today, that percentage has tripled. About 12% of the US population today has some kind of mobility challenge that allows them to directly benefit from the ADA's changes. But actually, come to think of it, we all have benefited. You've probably at some point or another had a child in a stroller while out and about around town, or you've taken the subway to the airport with a suitcase, and it's so nice not to have to lug your 53-pound suitcase up a flight of stairs. Or you've maybe temporarily had your leg in a cast just for a couple of months. So making the physical environment of our society more accessible, in fact, has made life better and nicer for us all. And we would very much argue that that's exactly what happens when we make organizations more fair as well. Men, just the same way as women, benefit from being evaluated fairly, having better access to opportunities, getting to work with the best of the best alongside them, instead of mediocre talent skimmed from a subset of the talent pool.
This was so beautiful, but I just wanted to acknowledge also that, of course, men are falling behind in certain areas too. And we are very transparent in the book that we work at the Women in Public Policy program, that our book primarily focuses on areas where women traditionally have been underrepresented, excluded, discriminated against. But we do mention a wonderful book by Richard Reeves, which is called Of Boys and Men. And that's all about areas where men are falling behind. For example, boys in school. What are we going to do with that? It's a real problem. What are we going to do with the fact that we don't have male teachers? He calls these actually HEAL professions. So a bit in an analogy to STEM. HEAL stands for health. The H stands for health, E for education, A for administration, L for literacy, where men are underrepresented and we don't have, for example, the role models for our boys. So we're not trying to make light of the opioid crisis more likely to affect men. Some of the challenges that this country is experiencing are absolutely more likely to affect men. And we need to think about those as we are thinking about the topics that Siri and I mostly work on.